We're seeing the influx of humans and drugs, and we're trying to do our damnedest to plug fingers in the holes of the dam, but it's a little overwhelming. And especially with whoever's in administration at the federal level determines your level of support, funding, manpower, equipment, all that kind of stuff. And so when we have an administration that just basically ignores the problem and says it's all okay, that definitely puts strain on our state, our law enforcement, and everything. We're probably, for us personally right now in our agency, we're at about a pursuit a day with illegal aliens or drug loads or any of that stuff that the cartels are pushing through. So every day we're chasing a load coming through our county headed into the interior.
Matthew Thomas, thank you for coming on the show. I'm not going to give too much of a introduction to you because we're going to get into it and we're going to let you unpack that.
Yep.
But I did read a good half of your book so far, and my plan is to finish it in the near future here.
Cool.
But there was something in the intro that stuck out. There's a few lines in the intro.
All right.
That I want to read before we introduce you, before we get into any of this.
Cool.
That I think states your intention for why you do what you do. So we'll start it here. It's my hope is that you'll gain an appreciation for the fact that this is not something we can defeat without every willing and able person standing with us in the fight. It takes a community to suppress and defeat the evil of the criminals behind these cartels. It takes parents, students, brothers, sisters coming together with the community leaders and law enforcement to stand firmly against evil. And that kind of seems like it's your mission statement.
Right.
So you are the deputy sheriff of Pinal County in Arizona.
I am a deputy sheriff. I am my official title is chief deputy, which basically is our second in command to the sheriff. So the sheriff heads the agency, and I'm his second.
Okay. And which the book you wrote is called Interceptors.
Mm-hmm.
And that unpacks kind of like your story from the very beginning of how you gained visibility on really the struggle that county and then across the nation is dealing with cartel, drug trafficking, human trafficking, all of it. And then how you developed a passion for serving those people, serving that county, and fighting that fight. So take things back to the beginning. Where are you from? How'd you grow up?
I am a Arizona native, which is used to be rare. It's getting more common because a bunch of people have moved here, and we have newer generations of natives. But I'm a native from the 70s and a third generation Arizonan. I grew up in South Phoenix, and most of the cops will know that anything on the south side seems to have trouble associated with it. And that it seems to be a south side of anything, right? South side Chicago, south side Phoenix. But I grew up in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. It was government subsidized housing. My mom was a single mom. She worked nights, so it was one of those things where the streets are right there. You grow up in that environment. You're around that environment. So I was around gangs. I was around dope. I was around all that stuff as I was in my adolescence, and just witnessed that world in front of me all the way up through high school. And then in high school, my mom recognized that a lot of my buddies were getting in serious trouble. She didn't want me to be a part of that trouble. And so she moved us out to a rural community, which was still predominantly Hispanic, farming community. And that's where I finished out high school and kind of I worked in the fields alongside migrants. And so I've been immersed in the Mexican culture pretty much my whole life. And I love it. I have a Mexican wife. I love the culture. I love the people. I love, everything about it. And, but that's where my knowledge base came from about the Mexican culture and the Mexican gangs and ultimately the cartels. Then got into law enforcement at a young age. At 20 years old, I started with Pinal County, and I've been here. It'll be 30 years in April, and started in our jail, worked in our jail for a little bit, and then went out to the road as a deputy sheriff, and then kind of bounced around. I worked undercover. I was an undercover supervisor. I was on our SWAT team. I was in motors training. I ran our police academy for a little bit, and was in our detective division for a bit, and then kind of promoted through the ranks up to my current position. I moved into this position in 2017 and have been the sheriff's XO since 2017, and kind of finishing out my career here.
Wow. So you've done it all.
I've done a lot. Yep. It's been interesting, and I tell people, like the insurance commercial, right? I know a thing or two because I've done a thing or two,
right?
And so that's kind of where I'm at. Yep.
So the sheriff's department in your county specifically, and I guess really in every county, to clarify, I think a lot of people know this, but a lot don't. The jurisdiction, the job expectations, the fact that the sheriff is a voted in position, like kind of walk through the differences between a typical police department and the sheriff's roles and responsibilities.
It's an important difference that people truly need to understand, especially in today's America. There's about 3,300 sheriffs across the U.S., so 3,300 counties approximately that have elected sheriffs. There's a few counties in the U.S. that have appointed sheriffs, which is a disaster, because the difference between a police chief of a city police department and a sheriff is that elected piece. And a police chief, my bad, dude.
Are you good?
A police chief is appointed by their mayor or city council, meaning they answer directly to that council, which is, of course, an elected board, but it's a board nonetheless. The sheriff is elected to his position by the people. So he is elected, and that's usually based on his stance on things, how he governs the agency, how he leads the agency, and his style of policing. And why that's important is because the sheriff has the power to say yes to things and say no to things as the head of the agency, and nobody can really override that other than the people that he ultimately works for, which are the citizens. So if the citizens think the sheriff is doing a bad job, they won't elect him again. If they think he's doing a good job, they will continue to elect him, and he'll continue in office. And that's a very powerful spot. And again, as we talk about today's America, it's very important because that becomes your last line of defense. And I'll give you an example here in Arizona. We had, during COVID, there were mask mandates issued by both the federal government and by our local government. The governor of Arizona put out executive orders saying, you have to do this or you have to do that. Well, our sheriff did not agree with some of those orders. And so he simply said, no, we're not enforcing that. And people are free to do what they want to do as per the Constitution, because that's the overriding document that we follow as a sheriff's office. And so that's why it's a very important position for when people go to elect their sheriff. They need to really pay attention to that.
So when he was able to say no to that ruling with, for example, the mask mandate, is that saying that the county sheriffs will not enforce, or the county will not enforce? Or is that one and the same?
No, it's kind of one and the same, but different. So if somebody were to call the sheriff's office and say, these people aren't, and we're going to use the mask example. I know that fires some people up, but if we're using the mask example,
it's ATF magazine. There's
we're
past that.
So if somebody, and we got these calls, believe it or not, hey, there's a group of people that aren't wearing their masks. We want you to arrest them. And we would say, no, we don't do that, because they have the right to do what they want, because this is still America. Well, the governor put out an order. Yeah, the governor's order does not supersede the Constitution. And as the elected sheriff, the sheriff can say, no, we're not doing that. And that's essentially what happened. Whereas police departments, if their governing board, i.e. city council or mayor, decided, yeah, we do want people wearing masks in our city, the police chief can be ordered to enforce those rules. And so in that sense, yes, the sheriff holds the power. But as a county, there's also the board, what a lot of people call commissioners or board of supervisors for us. So we have a 5-member board who represents 5 regions of the county. And they, as a board, also voted and said, we are, we're not doing certain things that are being pushed, like mask mandates, for instance. Sure. We're saying as a county, no, we don't believe in that. We believe in the people's choice for their medical well-being, and we left it at that. And that's the way we kind of pushed forward. And the sheriff ran unopposed his last election. So that should tell you, again.
That's Mark Lamb.
Yes, that's Sheriff Mark Lamb. A lot of people know him as the American Sheriff, best boss ever. That him running unopposed means that his constituents like the job he was doing, right? There's nobody that's going to run against him. So he got reelected to sheriff for his second term, which we're in now. And that's what we go off of, because if we're doing our job right, our citizens are going to put him back in office every time we come up on an election. And that's our gauge on the job we're doing for our constituents.
So your constituents, the people in the county, what do you think they're looking at in leadership in your county specifically as saying this is done right, this is done wrong? Because you guys have a lot of tension, especially being a border.
Right.
So talk through that. How do they gauge that versus federal government jurisdiction?
I think honestly, it's pretty simple. People try to complicate it, but they just do what's right. Like, what is the right thing to do? What feels right? And the sheriff and I are big on that as we talk, and we have discussions on what direction we're going to head, what leadership decisions we make. As a team, we talk through, is this the right thing to do? And again, we're guided by the Constitution. So it's a pretty good document to help guide you on what's right and wrong. But typically speaking, people know what's right and wrong. And so we just do what we believe is the right thing to do. And again, our board is of the same mindset, and they act that same way. And I think that's why our county actually runs pretty well. Yeah. And we have a pretty good relationship with our citizens because we're just regular dudes. Like, we're not trying to be anybody special. We don't think we're anybody special. And our leadership here has the humility to understand we're all just regular people. What feels right for me and my family? And why does it feel right? And is it guided by those principles? And if it is, then that's the right way to go. And people agree with that. And they're like, yeah, because that's what they want too. It seems like people want to be left alone and make their own decisions and be grown adults. And we want to do the same. And so, again, it's pretty simple and it gets overcomplicated, but it's basically just doing the right thing for the right reason.
That's great. That's That's oddly rare too.
I know.
Which is
politicians all the time, and it is rare.
So your focus specifically in the book, which is my closest reference and understanding for what your career has entailed, has been a lot of cartel activity and combating them coming through the border and then bringing whatever they bring with them through. Yeah. So let's talk through that. Yeah. First off, define what the cartel is specifically that you guys are dealing with, because that's a really, really broad term. Right. And I don't think a lot of people know what that really is.
And so to start from, like, to baby step anybody through this who has no idea what we're talking about.
Yep.
Essentially, the Mexican cartels are, it would be closely related to the Italian mafia model, the Cosa Nostra stuff that was going on the East Coast back in the 70s and 80s. It's much like that, right? It's a group of organized criminals that are tied together, usually like familial bonds and regional bonds. And, like I said, growing up in a neighborhood, they knew each other, they grew up together, and they grew into these criminals who ultimately grew into a criminal organization. And And so it kind of all started with Pablo Escobar is where it started moving the power shift towards Mexico. So Mexico was transporters. They were transporting, the Colombians' drugs up. When Pablo was taken out, that's when the Mexicans kind of moved and started to move into more of a power position and started becoming their own groups. And as that happened, they kind of had one dude that was the head. And then things happened with American law enforcement, with Mexico, and they kind of decided, hey, we need to regionalize. So the one big cartel in Mexico kind of regionalized itself into 5 cartels, and those were each responsible for a region of Mexico and getting the dope to certain places and all that stuff. Well, eventually there's fight for power and there's struggles going on there. So one region thinks it should get this and the other region thinks they shouldn't, and you have infighting, and that's what ultimately led to these regions or plazas becoming their own cartels and then having cartel fights with each other for those plazas to get their drugs into the U.S. And so those groups became their own organization, much like a mafia, and they started getting the name cartel, and it continues through today. They've fractioned. Cartels have broken apart where there's infighting in one cartel and they split into 2. And then another cartel will unite with this one to fight that one. And it's just a constant back and forth. All the while, their sole function in life is making money and gaining power. And most of that was driven by drugs being pushed into the U.S. And it has progressed into what they are now. They're now called transnational criminal organizations, which means they have a worldwide network, and they're involved in counterfeiting. They're involved in oil theft, gold theft, extortion, robbery, drugs. So they're in everything, and they're just a huge criminal organization. Pushing their poison and wreaking havoc while they do it.
How long has that affected your county?
Since we've been a state. I mean, where I'm standing now in this interview, this used to be Mexico before the U.S. made a land purchase, right, and moved the line. And so this fight has been going on. Our dope routes in southern Arizona, Pancho Villa used to run these smuggling routes, So there's been smuggling routes into the U.S. forever. It's just now the Mexicans in Mexico, those organized criminal groups, hold control of all of that market. And they've gained a lot of power, obviously, because they hold control. I would say they hold operational control over the Mexican military and law enforcement, even because they've corrupted that system so bad. So it's been here quite a while. It's just to what level and how they're doing it that has changed through the years.
On the Mexican side of the border, is this something that's being combated in the same way that the U.S. is fighting it on their end, or is it so woven in to law enforcement or military where it's the U.S. side pushing back?
No, so the Mexican side is doing what it can, but again, they have gotten themselves into power positions within the government and in the law enforcement, and they've corrupted those systems. So I don't want people to assume that all of Mexico is corrupt, like all politicians or all cops. But they're so embedded in the system that it's hard to fight. And you talk to the Mexican cops or the Mexican military that are fighting that battle, those dudes are in a hell of a fight to hold on to their country. I mean, you think about U.S. law enforcement. Yeah. If we were facing gangs that roamed the streets and just randomly shot people, hung them from bridges, skinned them alive in public, chopped off heads and threw them out on the roads and the sidewalks at Costco's and whatever, that's what they're facing down there. And so they rule by fear and intimidation, and they've got a death grip on that country, and the country is fighting like hell to maintain itself.
So in your book, in the beginning, you talked about the tactics that law enforcement, specifically in your county, had to use quickly shifted from being traditional law enforcement tactics to military operation.
Right.
Is that something that really kicked off when you were a part of that, or is that something that you joined in,
No,
kind of joined the fight with?
That definitely shifted while I was a part of it, because I was part of figuring it out. I did not have a military background. I've been doing this since I was 20. Did not go to the military, but what started happening, as you'll read in the book, or you may have read already, some of the operations that we were doing were more military movements. They were open land movements, and the bad guys had operational control of entire areas where they had LPOPs set up, listening posts, observation posts, where they were up on hilltops. They held control of those hilltops. They had their own radio network. They had their own encryption system. So they had communications going. They had a distribution network, a transportation network set up in the open desert that was under observation. And they would conduct essentially their movement operations of drugs into the U.S. or people into the U.S. And they did that as a military type movement, with their overwatch, with their communication, and they were with their countering law enforcement. And so we quickly had to figure out, because this is not traditional law enforcement to deal with that kind of stuff. That's military stuff. Yeah. And so we had to figure out how to counter that, how to interdict them, and how to disrupt them and dismantle them. And a lot of that consisted in our county specifically, and in some of the operations I talk about, a lot of that consisted of land navigation, remote area inserts of teams where they had to get to, high points to get their own LPOPs to counter the cartel scouts. And then interdiction operations where we had to sneak into areas because they have a whole valley under watch. And so you had to figure out how to sneak into these areas for proper placement on routes so that you could interdict dope loads coming up or human loads coming up. And they had their own protection. They had their own supply network to supply the people on the hilltops. And so it's an elaborate operation. And a local law enforcement, we were just not equipped to deal with that. So we figured it out along the way. And we leaned on some of our military buddies or some of our guys that had military experience. And we would employ those tactics and start using those tactics to counter these guys.
I was going to say, what kind of federal support do you get for that?
At the time, it all depends on who's in the White House, really. And so we initially, Border Patrol was Border Patrol on the ground, like the boots on the ground, the dudes working this stuff, and the board tackers, who I have an affinity for my board tack brothers, because those dudes are doing the Lord's work every day, and those are some pipe hitting dudes. Those guys would always help us, and we learned a lot from board tack because they were used to running those type of operations, and Border Patrol regular agents were used to running those type of operations. So we worked closely with them, but a lot of times if we have the wrong person in the White House, like now, they tie Border Patrol's hands where they can't help us like they want to. And so we went, it was ebbs and flows, man. There was years where it was great. We had good working partnerships with Border Patrol and Homeland Security, and we would all be pushing towards the same goal. And then there was years where they couldn't really push in the same direction, but behind the scenes, they were giving us we would get intel. They would teach us the ropes on some of the stuff that we were doing. And so that's why I say the boots on the ground, we always worked well together. It seems to be at the policymaker level that it always fell apart.
How pervasive of a problem have you seen this become through your career? Because it's talked about, I mean, just like the way the general public, especially here in the Midwest, I'm in Wisconsin, and it's like, I'm sure activity from it makes its way all the way up to the northern border.
Right.
But it's not this thing we're thinking about often.
Right. Yeah.
So what is that like there, especially living in it where you have the border right there, and so you're technically the first line of defense?
Yeah,
of
for
that
us,
stuff coming through.
it's an everyday problem. And while typically our county is referred to as a pass-through county, meaning the drugs are passing through to hit distribution hubs like Phoenix to then be redistributed throughout the U.S. Typically, what we tell people down here is like, yeah, we're at ground zero, but in today's U.S., every town is a border town. If you have blue M30 pills, you're a border town because that means you have some connection to the Mexican cartels because they control that. And so if they control it, you can be damn sure that they have operatives in whatever areas controlling the distribution of that. And they're using the street gangs in those areas to get that out there. So they're collaborating with them. And so every town in the U.S. becomes a border town. It just so happens that we're at ground zero here. So we're seeing the influx of humans and drugs, and we're trying to do our damnedest to plug fingers in the holes of the dam. But it's a little overwhelming. And especially, like I said, with whoever's in administration at the federal level determines your level of support, funding, manpower, equipment, all that kind of stuff. And so when we have an administration that just basically ignores the problem and says it's all okay, that definitely puts strain on our state, our law enforcement, and everything. We're probably, for us personally right now in our agency, we're at about a pursuit a day with illegal aliens or drug loads or any of that stuff that the cartels are pushing through. So every day we're chasing a load coming through our county and headed into the interior.
I was talking to someone about this conversation, trying to think of questions, trying to kind of wrap my head around what you guys are fighting and how you're fighting it. And something that was brought up is that you have bordering counties to yours that are fighting the same type of fight. Yeah.
And we're, so just for people's educational purposes, if they don't know our county, demographically, we are right in between, or not demographically, but geographically, we are right in between Phoenix and Tucson. So if you travel from one to the other, you go right through our county. I-10 does. Interstate 8 starts in our county and goes all the way out to San Diego. And so we are not right on the Mexican border. We are about 65 miles north of the border. But the uniqueness of our county is that portion of the southwest corner of our county is 65 miles of open desert all the way down to the U.S.-Mexico border. And where it hits the U.S.-Mexico border below us, that open desert, a lot of it is Indian reservation. And when you get to the border, some of that area, there's nothing. There's barbed wire or Normandy barriers. Sometimes there's vehicle barriers, and sometimes there's the wall that everybody is familiar with on TV. But there's a lot of gaps in that, and it allows for free flow of both human traffic and vehicle traffic. And so the counties below us, you have 4 counties below us that are all right on the border that are facing the same issues we're facing, if not worse, because they butt right up against Mexico. And it's the same thing. It's just an influx. And you could go down, like Yuma County is a perfect example. Yuma is at the southwest corner of our state, right up against California, and south is Mexico. And our governor, our last governor, was down there doing a press conference, and a group was walking behind him into the U.S. So, I mean, you got cops standing around, the governor standing there doing a press conference, and a group of illegals is just walking by right into the U.S. That's how prolific it is.
When people are crossing, is it, especially when it's linked to cartels, is it primarily, for lack of better words, human trafficking, or is it immigration that the cartel is facilitating, or how is that?
It's both. So there's both. There's people that are trying to get here for a better life.
Yeah.
And there's people that are being trafficked here. But the problem with both of those scenarios is the cartel controls it. So you have a criminal organization that holds operational control of that entire border. And so even if I'm a person that's just trying to get here for a better life, I want to get here and I'm being persecuted or whatever in my home country, I have to pay the cartel a certain amount. I have to follow their rules.
I was going to ask, what's their incentive?
Yeah, that they are getting paid. So if you want to cross through my territory in Arizona, you're paying anywhere from $4,000 to probably $12,000, depending on who you are, where you're from, where you're going. And so and you're paying. If you think about this as a business model, the cartel is brilliant in this sense because it's not a commodity that they're worried about losing. So when they ship dope up here, a lot of times dope is fronted. So the Mexicans are making fentanyl, they're making the M30 pills, they're shipping it across the border, and it gets to its destination, and then they receive payment, right? So if the load gets intercepted, they're out that money. With humans, what they're doing is they're charging that rate before you ever cross, and they're issuing like wristbands or some other method so that when you get north of the border, you get checked again. So the cartels check you on the south side, they make you pay, they give you your wristband to ride the ride. You get over to the U.S. side, you get checked again by the same cartel. Did you pay? Yes, you paid. And if you get a rogue cartel member, he may say, yeah, look, I know you paid $5,000 over there, but before I'll let you go any further, you owe me another $1,000. And so they're getting extorted out of more money. And then they're being released to do whatever they, go wherever they're going to go. And the cartel gets paid. So they don't care if that group of people gets intercepted after the cartel lets them go because they've got their payment already.
That's crazy. It's looked at as such a overly complicated process.
Yeah.
And it's like, by that explanation, it's a very simple.
Yep.
You control the border, you control the people.
Right.
Yeah.
They control they control the border, they control the people, they control the money. And that's, again, down here, what we've been screaming for probably a decade at least, is when we have congressmen and when they come from DC down here, and they usually are trying to get reelected or they want a photo opportunity or something like that. Most of them who come down here for those purposes, and they always ask you, what can we do? And we're like, well, shit, we've been telling you what to do for 20 years now, and designate these guys as narco terrorists, because that's what they are. Because if you designate them as narco terrorists, the U.S. can now take different measures to deal with them. And the U.S. can also take different measures to deal with the people that the cartels deal with. Because if you think about the jihadi type terrorists, if I was a street gang in the U.S. and ISIS said, hey, we want to partner with you on distribution of drugs, street gangs that are savvy are going to be like, hell no, dude, because there's a whole different level of problems that comes with being associated with terrorist organizations. And so that's what we're hoping for, is that we get some movement on getting them designated as narco terrorists, so that we can open up the floodgates, because they're driven by money and greed, right?
Yeah.
They're not driven by an ideology like some of the terrorists we deal with. They're driven by money and greed. And if we release some of our special dudes that do special stuff all over the world and start dealing with that problem, I think we're going to get a handle on it very quickly.
It's wild to me that hasn't happened, or that there's resistance to that happening. And I'm sure that's a much bigger conversation, but
yeah, there's a lot of politics involved in that.
But with such a clear enemy, you'd think that would be a quick decision.
Something my sheriff always makes a point to bring up in conversations like this is the fact that we've had, I think now we're up to about 120,000 deaths related to fentanyl. So if you think about it, and that's all the Mexican cartel, they're the ones pushing that into the U.S. So they've killed 120,000 Americans, poisoned them. If a terrorist from overseas blew up a building and killed 120,000 people, we'd be at war. Why are we not at war?
Yeah. Yeah, I was listening to a comedian talk about that, and he was like, I've done cocaine my entire life, and now I won't touch it.
Right.
Because you just don't.
Yep.
It's too dangerous. And not that it was not dangerous before, but it was like this fear that's been, in a healthy way, built into people.
Yep.
But then it's getting to kids, it's getting everywhere, and it's not just a southern border issue anymore.
Right. No, it's like I said, every town in America has a border issue right now.
For towns and counties like up here, for example, in Wisconsin, they don't have this direct connection to the source as much as border states. So for them fighting this issue that might kind of get put on the back burner just because of the distance, what is it that they can do to get more involved or get the people more involved? Because I'm sure that takes a push from the public.
Yeah, it definitely takes a push from the public, and it takes the backing of the community. And the first thing is to admit that you have a problem, because Wisconsin has a problem. You have Mexican cartels there. You have fentanyl. You have M30 pills. And so it takes officials first saying, shit, we have failed, because we have been talking about this problem for quite some time now. And we have been warning the U.S. before the flood went across the U.S. We've been warning people like, hey, this is coming. We can see it coming. And everybody says, oh, you're alarmist. Oh, it's only there. It's not our problem. It's not anybody's problem until it starts affecting them. And so when you start having politicians' kids die from being poisoned by fentanyl, then I think you're going to see some action happen, because that seems to be the only thing that gets their attention, is when it affects them personally, rather than just the normal people. So Wisconsin, USA, you have a fentanyl problem. You have a cartel problem. Michigan, USA, same thing. Idaho, same thing. It's all over. It's all throughout the U.S. They have they have operators who are forward deployed. That's how they operate. There's cartel throughout the U.S. We know that. And that's not even like secret intel. That's open source intel, that there's cartels all over the U.S. And you have fentanyl just flooding our streets. And people are rightfully so scared, right? Because I've never, I have kids, and I've worried about my kids getting involved in drugs. I've never worried about my kid dying from taking drugs until now, because it's one pill and they're dead.
Yep. Yeah, that's heavy. When was there a time in history that this really sparked to becoming this problem that's affecting, say, kids, for example? Because I feel like just in the recent, more recent news, it's all of a sudden becoming thing, and I don't know if that's because it's unavoidable or if it's just the next thing on the list that we're trying to tackle.
I think part of it's just the evolution. But honestly, if you want to look at America's problems, just look at America, right? And so we've kind of slit our own throats in this whole drug thing. So Americans started deciding we want to legalize marijuana. And so no matter where you stand on that issue, because I get that, especially having buddies that are vets, and they said, they'll tell you like, hey, I've seen amazing results from this. Cool, I get that. But I'm just going to tell you what happened. We started legalizing weed. Like for us in Arizona, the Sinaloans, their cash crop was marijuana. So they were constantly pushing marijuana into the U.S. That was one of their big cash crops. And then there was meth, and there was cocaine, and there was heroin, and those would always fluctuate different, right? Well, when the U.S. started legalizing weed, of course, that starts cutting into profits of what they're pushing. And so the Mexicans, the cartels, are very good at adapting, very good. And they're running a multi-billion-dollar business, so they have to be good at it, and they have to be agile. And so what happened was they realized early on, hey, this is going to be a problem. We need to shift our commodities. And so they started moving more towards synthetics. And then they realized with synthetics, hey, like if you're talking about marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, there are growing seasons associated with that. There's processing associated with that. And then the final product. If you're talking about synthetics, you're talking about just making a lab, mixing all the chemicals that we can freely get from the Chinese who are importing it into Mexico. And it's a 24/7, 365 operation. We don't have to grow anything. We just keep pumping out dope.
So now it's just a steady stream.
Steady stream. Yep. It's a constant stream. And the only thing they're limited by is their precursor chemicals. And again, the Chinese, I think if you understand where we're at in the world, the Chinese are not our friends. So if they can help somebody feed poison into our nation, why wouldn't they?
They're going to drop it with their balloons.
Yeah, right.
Gosh, I'm blanking now. I had a question, a very
Oh,
specific
good,
question. Oh, okay. No. You mentioned it. U.S. legalizing marijuana in states. How do you think that's affected the problem from state to state now? Because that explains the cartels change in how they're producing and how they're moving and what they're producing.
Right.
And then now they have this steady stream that's not affected by growing seasons and that whole process.
Yeah. Well,
but how do you think that's affected the people?
Well, it's obviously it has. So what has happened with society over time, as we talk about legalizing weed, right? They legalize marijuana, and that gets accepted more and more. It's getting accepted more and more across the nation. Mm-hmm. And whether people want to admit it or not, marijuana is a gateway drug, so we legalize it. We make it more normal. We make it not have the stigma that it had in the past. And so as you move forward in generations, for my generation, it was like, no, say no to drugs, and every drug is bad. Now it's like, well, I mean, weed's okay. And, maybe cocaine's okay. It's not that bad. You just got to, be careful with it. And so we're making this societal move into saying this is okay, that's okay. So it has less stigma attached to it. And so our youth are more prone to be in that society like, well, hey, this is okay. This is normal.
We'll try something new.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with this. And then if you think about pills specifically, the opioid crisis started way before fentanyl hit our streets, right? It was started back by the big pharma. And that's, that opens a whole nother can of worms and rabbit holes we can go down. So big pharma caused the initial opioid crisis in our nation, and which then caused the heroin epidemic, because what was happening is oxycodone was flooding the streets, right? But then all of a sudden, when it got restricted or regulated more and heavily, you couldn't get it. So what was the easy replacement for that? Heroin. And so again, the cartels realize this, and they're like, okay, so the Americans are hooked on pills that are opioids. They can't get those as easy. Let's get them more heroin, because they'll use that instead if it's cheaper. And that's exactly what happened. We started using heroin more. And now fentanyl was the follow-up punch to that. And so fentanyl started coming right behind the heroin, and it became the replacement for that opioid. So this opioid crisis has been going on for some time. So again, we can point back to ourselves, because big pharma here in the U.S., supported by our own government, started an opioid crisis, and it has continued for decades now.
Is this, I mean, the answer is yes, but then to elaborate, like, is this disheartening for you to see, especially having fought this for so long?
Yeah.
How does that affect your drive for continuing this fight? Because like you said, you've been doing this for nearly 30 years.
Right. Well, I'll answer the second part first. It doesn't affect my drive, because I think anybody that does this job, I think our military guys and gals, they understand that this is a higher calling, right? And you know that you're gonna lose some battles, and ultimately, I believe that I'm doing what I'm doing for the greater good, and so I'm always going to fight for that greater good, no matter how bleak it looks. And I think if we don't have that, and if we just say, well, it's, all hope is lost and the hell with it, let's just give it up, that creates a whole new set of problems for our whole society. Because whether people want to admit it or not, if you take a look at history and look at Rome, we are almost parallel to what they did to themselves. And so we're on track to just self-annihilate and implode if we don't get control on this. And control means, like you opened with, it means all of us getting involved, all of us standing together, us getting the message out there of the help that we need and the people that we need to stand with us. getting people in office that understand this and are willing to take a stand and say, no more, we're not going to, put up with it. And we're going to start fighting this battle the way we need to. So, I think we're still in the fight. I like to say that there's hope on the horizon. I think honestly, it's just America waking up and saying, no, enough is enough. And we're not going to do this anymore.
Right. Yeah. How can people support sheriff's departments, the work you guys are doing, their local police departments? Like, what do you think is the most effective way? Because especially in positions like law enforcement, for example, or police departments, it's not a voted elected position.
Right.
These guys are just getting hired. So what's your direct link to supporting them? Or what's our direct link?
The easiest way for people to support the proper cause, support the good, support the cops, the law enforcement throughout the world, is to get involved. Talk to your local law enforcement leaders, understand what problems they're facing. And then if you're talking about sheriffs, making sure that you elect a sheriff that understands the problem and is going to deal with the problem. If we're talking about police chiefs, elect a board, a council, a city council, a town council, elect those people that understand the problem and hire a person that understands and will deal with the problem. And the biggest part is this: if they don't, if you hire an elected official to do the job that you're asking them to do and they don't, then you fire their ass and you elect somebody else and get them in there. And we start getting people involved too. I tell people all the time, it starts at the ground level. Your schools, school councils, city councils, state legislature positions. We need people that understand what is right and what is good to stand up and get in those positions and start pushing back and saying, no, we're not doing this anymore. And that's what it's going to take to right this ship.
It's frustrating to see, like, when elections come along and then people don't make it to vote and they're like, I voted for the big one this year. And there's this this lack of importance that people think, or people don't realize how important those votes are.
Right.
Like, it's just city council.
Right. Yeah.
And then the next month they're complaining about something in their city. It's like, you can do something about this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if you think about it, like, if I elect my city council member and that city pushes in a certain direction and we flourish, and it's really not the city, it's the money of that city. So when you attract good businesses and businesses flourish and do well, they hold power. They start holding power bigger than the city. They start holding power at a regional level or a state level. And then politicians start paying attention, because if a city is saying, hey, this is how we want things, and if you don't support us or you don't support the way we're headed, we're going to go against you rather than for you. That's where we start getting this corrected and start, getting politicians in that are willing to stand for what's right and aren't just controlled by special interest groups and are doing it for the right reasons.
So what's next for you? You're the chief deputy sheriff.
Yep.
You're 29 years, going on 30 in this department, more or less, or in the county. Where do you want to end up?
A fucking Walmart greeter, dude. That's pretty much it.
We need some good greeters. I mean,
I don't want to be in charge of anything or anybody. I just want to say welcome to Walmart and
yeah, but they got rid of the smiley face stickers.
I know, dude.
That was the worst thing they've done.
No, honestly, I really don't know. I think, having done this career this long, I have probably another couple of years left in me, according to my plan in my head. Obviously I wrote a book and I'm starting to, push that book out there and get that in front of more people. I do some speaking events, I do some teaching. And so I'm trying to work my way into that world and just kind of gracefully bow out of this realm and, kind of ride off into the sunset and enjoy a few years with my wife, my kids, my new grandkid, and and fight the fight because again, I know the fight. I've been in the fight, and I feel like I could be an asset behind the scenes for people that are willing to step up and want to push forward with this.
Yeah, I think voices like yours and stories like yours are important, and it's tough. We were talking about our reach for this publication and our other publications that we have, and we're like, messages like this are hard to get into people's view that don't want to see them. Or like you could have something that does well on YouTube and it circulates well, but it's circulating to the people who already watch that type of content. And so we're doing our best to try to get this into people's views that don't or wouldn't have otherwise seen it. And there's a lot of guys out there that are producing content and telling their story and training and just trying to equip the country for success. And we're doing our best and we're doing what we can to be able to push that message out. And I think you focusing on that piece going in the future is going to be really important.
Yeah, I believe so too. And I really feel like, that's where my heart has taken me, is to just start helping people understand a law enforcement perspective from a career law enforcement guy, a perspective of what we're fighting here, a perspective of how criminals behave and what's really going on behind the veil of order and chaos. And then hopefully inspiring some of the younger people to not only get into this career, but to pick up their stuff and start pushing forward in the overall fight for good. Man, if I just feel like I could help in that realm, but again, not at the helm, just from behind the scenes. Yeah.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to see where that takes you. We'll push this out and we'll get your message out. Where can people find you? Where can people find the book?
The book you can get, you can go to my website. It's onetimenation.com, or you can go to Amazon or Apple Books. It's on either of those. I don't have an Audible yet. I'm working on that. I want to get an Audible version out because I've had a lot of people ask for that. Social media is I'm most active on Instagram, almost exclusively on Instagram. That's where I do some of my stupid feeds. And if they're
looking, you work out every day.
I do workouts, because workouts my escape, and I have fun with my wife. I refer to her as the hot nana, and I mess with her and just have fun. We have fun together. We've been together 30 years, and so I just try to have fun on my social media. But I'm Instagram. I am at deputy_onetime is my handle, and so people can find me there, and that's where I put out most of my messages and my content.
Awesome. Well, we will, if you missed those by watching this, we'll make sure this gets in the link in the video when we post it in the description. So thank you very much for doing this.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely, man. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Anytime. Thank you.
Yep.